You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 10th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stands trial today with protesters outside, just as yet another potential front in the country's war with its neighbors opens up to the east in Syria. From Israel to a major shift in China as authorities look to stimulate the country's flagging economy. We'll explore what that means for the world. We'll also get the latest business headlines, and finally,
10 years ago, we didn't have strong, independent films with a nice expression. Today, it's coming back.
We check in on the Red Sea Film Festival in Jeddah and the rise of Arab filmmaking. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. We start today's show in Israel. There have long been questions over whether Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may have an interest in extending Middle East conflicts in order to distract from his own political and legal troubles. Well, today both of those come to a head once again as he testifies in court for the first time in his corruption trial, just as Israel launches strikes on Syria and considers further incursions from the Golan Heights in the east. Well, we're joined now by Julie Norman, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at UCL and Senior Associate Fellow on the Middle East at RUSI. Julie, great to have you on, well, quite an extraordinary week once again in the Middle East. I wonder if you could start by talking about this trial and just give us a rundown of kind of the charges that Netanyahu is facing and what's going to happen today.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, Chris, and indeed a very busy week in the Middle East. So for Netanyahu, he is taking the stand today in regards to charges involving bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. There's actually 3 different cases, and these have been in play for almost 5 years now. The indictments came in 2019. There have been beginnings of trials back in 2020, and then various delays, and then even this year, Netanyahu requesting many further delays to avoid this particular day of actually having to take the stand himself and begin testifying. The charges relate in terms to giving favors to either business persons or to media outlets in exchange for gifts or for complimentary coverage in the media. So that's really what these center on. Netanyahu has framed these as a witch hunt. He's blamed these on the deep state, etc. But many in Israel feel that this is far time for Netanyahu to have to answer for what they see are some of these criminal allegations.
Well, and he's tried to delay this partly, obviously, for political reasons, but also just in terms of the amount of time that this is going to take up is really pretty incredible. I mean, it's 6 hours, 3 days a week, multiple week. I mean, how does a prime minister even manage without that encroaching on their day job?
Well, that's right. And that's what Netanyahu has always said. And that was even before the war, but then certainly since the war. He said, look, we're fighting a multi-war front. How can you be asking the prime minister to be, giving testimony 3 days a week? And as you noted, this isn't just getting up once and then speaking for an hour or something. We're looking at this probably lasting at least through the end of the month. And as you said, requirement of 6 hours for 3 days a week. And so this is going to be a very significant time for Netanyahu, I think. And the Israeli public is watching all of this very closely, as they have been, not only for what comes out in the trial, but for what this means with what's going on more broadly in the region as well.
Well, and to that point of the public watching this very closely, you did mention that Netanyahu obviously sees this as a witch hunt. That harkens back to some other people who have been facing trials and accusing their opponents of witch hunts. It isn't always an ineffective, I have to say, approach, if you will, on the sort of public voting side of this, and I just wonder if you think he's had any success with that. How does the Israeli public currently see this trial? Has everyone kind of made up their minds one way or the other?
Well, the trial has been very divisive in Israeli society. And again, really since these indictments began some years ago. And as you very carefully alluded to, we see a similar dynamic in the U.S. with Trump, where many of those supporters of Netanyahu or Trump, respectively, sometimes a trial like this deepens their support, while for their opponents, it just deepens that opposition. For Israel, this has been intertwined with attempts to reshape the judiciary. This was the big issue in Israel prior to October 7th and prior to the war. And a lot of that was seen as sort of advantageous for Netanyahu as well, while under these criminal investigations. So I would say, for Israelis, very split, and even on the more right-leaning side, a split. That's one reason why we saw, I think, 4 Israeli elections in 5 years prior to October 7th, was even many who agreed with Netanyahu's policies didn't want to support someone who was accused of crimes in this way. But again, others have kind of come back to the fold, have sort of rallied around Netanyahu in the wake of October 7th. And I would say even more so in these last several months, when Netanyahu has made the argument that his policies led to the weakening of Hezbollah, of Iran, and now even the fall of Assad.
And Julie, what do you make of, I suppose, all this talk, suggestion that wars in Gaza and Lebanon, potentially now to a degree in Syria as well, distract from Netanyahu's domestic situation? Do we expect a trial like this to sort of add to that?
Well, I think that the trial will, to some degree, distract, but will also put the pressure on. For many Israelis from across the political spectrum, getting the hostages back from Gaza is the number one priority, regardless of what people think about some of Netanyahu's other actions and whatnot. And so I think this idea of, again, distracting even further from that goal will be very, very frustrating to some. But many feel that it's just time for Netanyahu to, again, have to own up. I think for many, they would like to see him, have to own up more for the failures of October 7th, security intelligence failures, what have you, just as much, if not more so, than these prior allegations. But it will be, all of these things are somewhat intertwined at the end of the day. But the pressure will be on Netanyahu, as always, to get the hostages back and to wind down the war.
Well, speaking of everything being intertwined, Julie, when you talk there about the priority for many being the return of the hostages, Syria is now coming into this dynamic as well, and is potentially another different distraction from that effort to bring the hostages back. What can you tell us about Israel's response to what's happened in Syria this week and what they've been up to so far?
Yeah, so I'm sure that listeners have been following the very rapid flow of events in Syria with the fall of Assad. What is unclear now, of course, is what happens next in Syria. Who will take control? If it will be the primary rebel group HTS, if it will be others. From Israel's point of view, there is kind of there was a sense of a devil we know, so to speak, with Assad. This vacuum does create security challenges for Israel. From their point of view, they want to be doing everything they can to secure their border, and specifically the buffer area in and around the Golan Heights. So I should say the Golan Heights is an area that Israel has annexed. Much of the world still sees that as occupied Syria. Israel has now expanded even further past that with some of their military movements in the last couple of days, targeting certain military targets with airstrikes, but also actually moving even further into the territory, creating almost a buffer zone to the buffer zone, if you will. And so I think, again, Israel is trying to say, look, we're very concerned about having, say, an Islamist group or groups kind of taking over that territory, having access to some of these weapons in some of these areas. But much of the international community is also watching this very closely to make sure this isn't just a further exploitation and resulting in, again, even further facts on the ground that will be hard to reverse later.
Well, if I wonder if you could build on that a little bit more, because I do wonder on exactly that point. Obviously, it's very early to say, but given the fact that Israel is is going into this demilitarized zone, as you said, the so-called area of separation. I mean, can we expect them to withdraw again from that? Or is there more of an expectation also being discussed in Israel that they can establish a new set of facts on the ground?
Yeah, I think this is being debated, and it's been really interesting to watch the language, Chris. You know, in some of the English statements, there's been very clear statement. This is a temporary situation to secure that demilitarized zone border area. But in the Hebrew language statements, that word temporary has not been as present. And so I think there is this sense that as many things as we've seen that go in seemingly temporary do become much more long lasting. And for Israel at this moment, still feeling very threatened after the October 7th attacks, after the last year of war and whatnot. As we've seen in Lebanon, as we've seen elsewhere, Israel is not being shy right now about kind of staking out further ground to do what they feel is necessary for their security, even though, again, many other actors will look on that as problematic and probably facing some pushback.
And just finally, Julie, I know we've been going through so many different issues today, but what has been happening in Gaza in the meantime? Because that war, that conflict is still continuing right now as well. Is there any effort when it comes to getting the hostages back?
Yeah, so I would say on the ground, still an extremely dire situation, especially in the north. We know that a flour kind of supply line was hit this last weekend, which again hurts all kinds of food access and security. So things just continue to just get worse, I would say, in Gaza. There is another push right now for a ceasefire. I don't think this would be a full ceasefire as much as, say, some kind of short truce to at least get some sort of hostage and prisoner release kind of before the U.S. transition. But, we've come so close to pauses, truces, ceasefires in the last 6 months that I think, most of us are very cautious about being too optimistic about these processes until some things really coming through.
Well, thanks very much for unpacking all of that with us, Julie. That was Julie Norman, Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI. Now here's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. China has sent its largest naval fleet to waters near Taiwan in nearly 3 decades. Taipei's military has raised the threat level to severe. Ghana's ex-president and opposition leader John Dramani Mahama has been declared the winner of the country's presidential election. Mahama said he would renegotiate terms of an IMF bailout, ease business regulations and enact tax reforms. And Boeing has reportedly resumed production of its 737 MAX jetliner. The move would come after over 3,000 factory workers went on strike for 7 weeks. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. For decades, China's economy has been the envy of many nations, but in recent years there have been questions about whether it might all come crashing down, whether the country that provides so many cheap goods around the world might need to stimulate its own consumers to spend more money. Well, this week, China announced plans to loosen monetary policy for the first time in 14 years, a sign that authorities are now taking this seriously. Well, Sean Ryan is Managing Director of China Market Research Group and the author of a new book, The Split, Finding the Opportunities in China's Economy in the New World Order. Sean joins us now. Great to have you on the show. What did China say in the central bank, first of all, and how big a shift is this in their thinking?
Well, it's great to be here, Chris. As you said, China's economy has soared at a double-digit clip for 30 or 40 years. But the last 3-4 years, China's economy has hit a wall. And we've had a really bad unemployment situation. So youth unemployment hit 17.2% last month, where the D word or deflation is hovering over the country for the last couple of years. So the government yesterday in a Politburo meeting changed some wording, which I think is important for businesses and investors to know. For the first time since December 2009, they said that China would launch a moderately loose monetary policy. They used the words moderately loose. Now, this is a big change, and I think it had to have been done because, like I said, the labor markets are weak, the stock markets are down about 50% off their all-time highs, and perhaps most importantly, the real estate sector is down 20-30% off of their all-time highs. So there's a fear that we could be running into a Japanification of the Chinese economy. So the government moved fast last night with the words. Now we need to see the actions.
Well, and tell us more than about what kind of actions we expect to follow up on those words. I mean, how aggressive, I guess, do you expect China to get on this? Or is it at this point more just, a shift in sort of thinking, and they're still trying to figure out exactly what that means in terms of the action?
Yeah, I think that's really the problem, Clarice. I think right now the government is still trying to figure out what exactly should they do? What can they do? So they're worried about having too much debt taken on at the central government level. A lot of local governments at the provincial side have run out of money because they had to spend billions and billions of dollars during the zero COVID era. They've run out of tax dollars. So the government might increase the overall debt to GDP to about 4%. Which is much higher than the 2 to 3% annually that they normally do. They've already announced that a 10 trillion RMB, about a 1.2 trillion US dollar monetary policy stimulus, where they basically eased up on the debt prices. But the real thing, Chris, that the government needs to do is get people jobs. We need to have a fiscal stimulus. Now, people are throwing out crazy numbers on Wall Street that they need to do 10 trillion RMB, which would be double or triple what the China did in 2008. But the reality is I don't think the Chinese government has the stomach to do that anytime soon. They're going to wait until they see what Trump and what the Trump regime might do to China by slapping on more tariffs in 2025 and maybe 2026. So I think China's trying to hold a lot of dry powder just in case the situation economically, politically, and potentially even militarily gets worse between the U.S. and China.
Well, and I did want to ask you about the tariffs debate, but before that, I'm curious just in general as well, when it comes to what China's thinking about stimulating growth here, going into debt, what does that mean? How does that impact the rest of the world's economies? Because China, in the past, typically it's the country that buys up everybody else's debt. It doesn't go into debt itself.
Yeah, so China is the biggest buyer of American T-bills over the last decade. They've also powered a third of global growth over the last 10 years. So if China's economy weakens and gets sick, that's going to cause the entire global economy to get sick. So I think countries from the global south, even to those in the G7 and the UK, really are hoping that China's consumers are going to start spending again. Right now, Chinese consumers are sitting on about 20 trillion of household savings. They're just scared to go out and buy, which is why you've seen the sales of Louis Vuitton, Porsche, Starbucks have all collapsed 20 to 30% in the last 6 months because the Chinese consumer just isn't willing to go out and spend right now. So I think the whole world is hoping that the stimulus policies from the Chinese government will get Chinese consumers to go out and spend in the coming months.
So, Sean, the whole world is looking to China and what they're going to do on the stimulus. And meanwhile, China is looking at what Donald Trump is going to do when he comes into office. What do you expect from that then when it comes to the tariffs? I mean, is there a recognition, I suppose, at this point in China, based on also the kind of stimulus stuff, that trade is not going to be the engine for them that it once was, that these tariffs are really going to change the game?
You might actually be surprised. A lot of Chinese prefer Donald Trump as president to Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. And the reason is under Biden and the worries under Harris was that it would be an ideological struggle between liberal democracies and communism, between American imperialism and hegemony versus China trying to raise a new world order. So there was a fear in China that we'd be dealing with 10, 20 years of political tension with a Biden, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz type of regime. With Trump, they feel that he's a businessman. He almost has a pathological desire to get a deal done. So the Chinese feel that Trump is going to use an awe and shock strategy where he's going to exert maximum pressure on China with tariffs, by screaming and bluster. But my belief is that there's going to be a deal between Trump and China. It might not happen in year one of his administration. It might not happen in year 2 or year 3, but it's going to happen. And he's going to take less of an ideological bent in his attacks on China. I actually think that Trump is going to be good to China. You can see that he's appointed a lot of attack dogs like Marco Rubio to be Secretary of State. And he's going to use people like Rubio to attack China. And then my belief, and you've heard it here first, is Rubio is going to be out by Christmas 2025 as Secretary of State because he's going to fail in scaring the Chinese.
That is quite the prediction, Sean. One more thing before we let you go. Just with all of this uncertainty, I'm curious, China is still expected at a meeting later this week to set a growth target of 5% for next year. I mean, is that doesn't sound bad, or is it just completely unrealistic?
5% is really quite good. So when a lot of people are talking about how weak China's economy is, and it is weak, we also need to put it into perspective. If China continues to grow at 5% a year, that's like adding an entire Vietnam and Thailand economy together. So scale matters. A lot of businesses say we want to go to Vietnam to expand, or we want to go to Sri Lanka to expand, or even India. But the reality is China has the scale, and only China has the scale to power third of the global growth market, which is why for most companies and for most investors, you need to always understand, despite the weak economy, China is the next China.
Sean Ryan, Managing Director of China Market Research Group. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak, and we're joined now for a look at business news with Ewan Potts, the Bloomberg reporter. Ewan, always good to have you on the show. And we're going to be focusing particularly for today on Russia and how it's evading Western sanctions. Tell us more about that.
Chris, when Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022, the West was quick and it was resolute in imposing sanctions on the Russian economy. You remember those scenes of McDonald's and other retailers in Russia closing down. It looked like the sanctions would be effective, crippling Moscow's war effort. Well, the truth is Russia's economy is doing just fine. GDP is set to grow this year. And crucially, oil exports have continued. China and India and other countries are still buying Russian oil. So Russia is still getting the foreign currency that it needs. And a new Bloomberg investigation has looked at how American microchips are even finding their way to Russia as well. New details about a surprisingly resilient supply chain from Silicon Valley to Moscow. It follows the trail of chips made by Texas Instruments. And the purchasing process is surprisingly simple. Some Russian distributors have actually integrated information from the online shop of Texas Instruments onto their sales platforms. So that allows their clients to see chip inventory and pricing before they place requests. In one case in the investigation, a major Russian distributor handled more than 4,000 orders for hundreds of thousands of products from Texas Instruments worth about $6 million. And 2/3 of those were destined for military uses. Texas Instruments, for its part, says that it strongly opposes the use of its chips in Russian military equipment and that it screens more than 4 million orders every year. But it all adds to evidence of the difficulty of imposing effective sanctions.
Well, it absolutely does add to that evidence, doesn't it? I mean, what are governments trying to do about this? I mean, are they aware of it? I know the US and others, I mean, they are always looking at adopting new sanctions, more sanctions, finding different ways. I mean, one of the more recent ones that we did see from the US was also sanctioning Gazprom Bank. I mean, is any of that having an effect?
Well, it's certainly fair to say that massive sanctions do have an effect. But in the case of Russia, they have been pretty ineffectual. When it comes to microchips, there was some criticism of a number of the big companies, including Texas Instruments, for their inability to stop their products getting through to Russia. Interesting, I think, to look at how this affects the Chinese situation as well, because, of course, sanctions on China are a key weapon in Washington's arsenal as well. And if we find that they're ineffective, then that is going to play its way into the trade war as well.
Ewan Potts, Bloomberg reporter, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, we head to Jeddah, where the Red Sea Film Festival kicked off on the 5th of December and wraps up this weekend. In between screenings and conversations, Mandy Sinclair sat down with Antoine Khalif, the film producer and the festival's director of Arab programs and film classics. Mandy began by asking about what's trending in Arab cinema right now.
I don't say it's rising. I think it's something, a new vision. It's stories. It has another level, if I may say. especially from two countries, Tunisia and Egypt. Egypt and Tunisia, they have today something so strong. I believe that the directors, they have a lot of stuff to say about what's happening, and they say it in a very subjective and intimate way, especially in Tunisia. What's happening in the society, what happened before in the society, we can feel it. The films are so strong. And in Egypt, we had a problem like 10 years ago, we didn't have a strong, independent films with a nice expression. Today, it's coming back.
And what are some of the themes or topics that you're seeing cinema in the Arab world is now addressing and tackling in their films?
It's a lot political, but in a political, it's not about political. It's about society. The problem with the women in the society, for example, this is a major, and the problem with like you take of Tunisia. Tunisia, it's about how a woman, she wants to find herself in the society. She wants to express herself in it. Even when you take, for example, in Egyptian films, they talk about like we have a film called Wedding Dress. It's called about a girl that she only wants, all what she wants is to have a wedding dress for her wedding. She's not able to find the appropriate wedding dress. She doesn't afford it. So it's the stories, it is about the struggling that the people, they have on a daily basis, and this is related to the political, to what's happening in the countries.
And here at the Red Sea Film Festival in Jeddah, there are 54 shorts.
It's 44 between Arabs, and Saudi films. The short films, it's based for this Red Sea because we really want to discover the new talent of the cinema. This is not something new, but it's very strong in Saudi Arabia in particular, where we have strong short film now. Not in the Arab world. In the Arab world, we always have a numbers of short film. But in Saudi Arabia, it became very, very strong. But it's not just a number. It's just about quality also and about the subjects that are treated.
There are quite a few female directors and lead actresses in the films that you're showing. Is that a trend that you're seeing across Arab cinema?
No doubt about this. I'm not talking about the trend about female filmmakers, but about the female characters. Now the female characters are coming back like it used to be in Egypt in the 50s and 60s, where the cinema, where the main character was a woman. This has disappeared a little bit, and now it's coming back, including one is my driver and I. The people that they really loved it. It's about the filmmaker. She's talking about her own story when she was a baby and she was a child, and she has a driver from Sudan who used to take care of her, and he became like a second father for her because her father was always away. And she's talking about the story between her and this driver who is like her father. Last year, I remember we showed a Jordanian film called Inshallah, a Boy, about this woman that's struggling to keep her house after her husband passed away. Yes, it was on her. And we feel that these 2-3 years, more and more films are the main character is the woman. I don't want to say a strong woman, but I'm to say woman struggling to keep her independence.
And what support is the Red Sea International Film Foundation providing filmmakers in the region?
You know, the Red Sea Film Festival, it's a foundation. The foundation, there is the festival, but we have also what we call the Red Sea Fund, but also what we call the labs. So the festival where you discover the films, we watch the film. But for the Red Sea Fund, we help the films from the region, from Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, and from Africa, and now from Asia. We support them financially. We have a selection committee. They read the script or they watch the film. It's in the 3 phases, in development, production, or post-production. So we support financially a lot of films, including films from the region, of course.
That was Mandy Sinclair in conversation with Antoine Khalif at the Red Sea Film Festival in Jeddah. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riota, our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.